Hey you guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to our next entry in our Fallout 4 Deep Dive series. Last episode, we took a look at the tragic backstory of Edgar Swan, so be sure to check that out if you haven't done so already. In the meantime, if you enjoy Fallout content, be sure to subscribe for more lore videos and join our growing community here on YouTube. Also, be sure to check out my Twitch and YouTube live channels. I tend to broadcast 3 days a week, normally at 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I would like to also mention that I have a community Discord as well as social media that's linked down in the description below. I'll always post schedules for future uploads as well as live streams. But without further ado, let's get into some Fallout 4.
Whoa, Nick Valentine?
Today, we're going to be taking the time to dive into one of Fallout 4's more lovable characters, Nick Valentine. Now, before we get started, I just want to remind you guys we are referring to the Fallout Wiki, and it's a great website if you guys have not checked it out. If you want to follow along with what we're talking about, go over to the Fallout Wiki page, pull up the Nick Valentine website page and follow along, support the website. It's a great group of people that does an amazing amount of digging into Fallout's lore. But anyways, we'll be exploring the mysterious Nick Valentine today. And as many of you guys know, he can be rescued pretty early on after we arrive in Diamond City. He's unlocked as a companion. Now, Nick is indirectly introduced to us, the player, as a useful companion that can assist us in our process of finding our son, Sean. After we arrive at Valentine's detective agency in Diamond City, we're informed that Nick is missing. So naturally, we offer to find him. Once locating Nick in Vault 114, which we have done a dive video on, so if you've not seen that yet, be sure to check it out when you're done watching this one. We do learn very quickly that Nick is not quite what we were expecting as a detective. As just mentioned, Nick Valentine's not exactly what we were expecting as a detective when we located him. He's in fact a synth, and to be specific, we find out that Nick is a Gen 2 prototype synth. This particular model of prototype was used to test how well synths could handle independent thinking and have their own personalities. Nick is the sole detective of the Valentine's detective agency located in Diamond City, but he is assisted by Ellie Perkins as, you guessed it, his assistant. So, and she's the one that kind of sent us off to go rescue Nick. Now, before Nick escaped to the Commonwealth and began his life in Diamond City, he and his brother, and I say brother with quotes because, well, they're synths, but they recognize each other as brothers, Dima, had been experimented on. Now, we won't be spending any time discussing Dima in this video since he's located within the Far Harbor expansion and we're not there yet in that part of our playthrough. But maybe once we get there in our playthrough, we can spend some time making a video discussing Dima. That's totally up to you guys if you'd be interested in that. I'd love to make a video on it. But I do believe it's important to know, though, that Dima and Nick had a brother type of relationship whenever they did escape the Institute together. So I think that's an important thing to note, that they did go through a lot together, which we're about to get into.
I wouldn't be here if it weren't for your two-timing dame, Skinny.
Nick Valentine was not initially Nick Valentine. He was actually a synth created by the Institute over a century before 2287. Now, this video is not going to go too much really into talking about the Institute. You'll hear me mention it. Just understand it's another faction in the Fallout 4 the Fallout universe that works specifically with synths as well as other things. Once we actually discover the Institute in our playthrough, I will definitely be making a video diving into the Institute, just like how we'll be doing the Brotherhood of Steel, as well as the Underground, like the Railroad and all of them. I said Underground Railroad, but the Railroad, and we'll discuss that at a later time. But just understand the Institute created him as well as Dima. But anyways, Nick was one of 2 uniquely designed prototypes for the Gen 2 synths. These were prototypes used to test how synths could handle independent thinking as well as individual personalities of their own. Nick was being used. The experiments on Nick was to implant artificial personalities based on memory recordings of pre-war humans. And while the other synth, Dima, was allowed to develop his own personality based off of his own experiences. Now, we don't know the exact number of years, but it's safe to assume that the experimentations on Nick and Dima both had gone on for a very, very long time. Enough time had passed on Dima, at least, that his thoughts matured enough through his experiences to know that he had grown tired of those experiments that the Institute was, performing on both himself as well as Nick, and he knew it was time to escape. We do know that Nick Valentine's last personality upload was that of a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine. He was left in a state of confusion because he suddenly woke up and 200 years had passed, and he was wandering about in the wasteland with his brother Dima. Now, when seeing his brother, Dima, Nick attempted to attack him out of confusion, but was knocked out and left behind. We're not really sure how much time had passed, but we do know that Nick woke up in a pile of garbage and spent several weeks wandering around in the wasteland in a state of confusion, and eventually forgot about his relationship with Dima due to the limited capacity of his prototype brain.
Your secretary, Ellie, she sent me.
She did. I should give her a raise.
Most of the Wastelanders were extremely unfamiliar with the Institute and their technology, so most of them regarded Nick with equal parts of fear and awe. Eventually, Nick earned trust with a small local community where a mechanic helped repair the damage he had sustained during his travels. And it was during this time that Nick befriended a child named Jim, who was the first remembered human contact. This community was the first group of people to treat Nick as a human being rather than a mechanical monstrosity since his reawakening. Nick eventually left this unknown settlement, and upon visiting it years later, he discovered it had been destroyed by raiders. Nick, after this, eventually found himself traveling into Diamond City. Now, although Diamond City held a strong hatred of the Institute and their synths,
Put the gun down.
Whoa.
Now. He's a synth. He'll kill us all.
Oh.
Kyle, no. Okay.
Oh.
Show's over. There are no synths in Diamond City. Hear me? Just you folks and your damn paranoia. Hey.
He pulled a gun on me. My own brother.
What happened?
What happened?
I'm not a synth. I told him. I kept telling him. Why didn't he listen to me?
Nick did gain their trust and their respect by saving the daughter of Henry Roberts, which was the mayor at the time. After she ran away with the caravan trader and his companions, which, unknown to her, were actually kidnappers who proceeded to take her hostage. During the process of looking for and saving the mayor's daughter, Nick did find himself held up at gunpoint by them. And in order to scare them and to get them to do what he wanted, Nick convinced them that he had a bomb inside of himself and it would detonate if they didn't do what he said. And then he began to literally beep or say the word beep, beep, beep over and over and over again. Once the girl was released, Nick then returned her to her father, the mayor, and he was rewarded with a home in Diamond City, even though the citizens highly objected of this. To ease the tension within Diamond City, Nick acted as the city's handyman and assisted with tracking down missing people. Nick had assisted with locating several runaways, including one that was presumed dead, but it turned out that this woman had run away with her lover at the time. Once it was realized Nick truly had detective skills, people stopped asking him to fix things and asked him to help investigate things and became Diamond City's very own private investigator.
How come whenever something interesting happens around here, you're right in the center of it?
There are some things we're going to be discussing in this next section that are from portions of Fallout 4 that I myself have not completed yet, but I do believe that they're very important plots to notate in Nick's story so we better understand him as a character. Now, as mentioned earlier, we're introduced to Nick Valentine pretty early on when we, the sole survivor, rescue him in Vault 114, when he was locked up in the Overseer's office after a confrontation with Skinny Malone and Darla. This is where we have the ability to enlist his help with tracking down the sole survivor, our missing son, Sean. So eventually, after we rescue him and we have him follow us throughout our time in the Commonwealth, eventually he's going to open up to us, the player, and ask him to help tie up one last final loose end of the original Nick Valentine's life. Now, that loose end, we will eventually find out that it's to bring down his old rival, Eddie Winter. There are 10 holotapes of Eddie Winters that the player as well as Nick must track down. And then once we discover those, or the player finds them, Nick uses them to decode Eddie's hideout and password to get access to that location. And once inside, Nick confronts a ghoul version of Eddie Winters, who doesn't even recognize Nick due to him being a synth. Again, Nick Valentine that we know from Fallout 4 is not the real original Nick Valentine, right? So whether we choose to further assist Nick or not, he's going to be killing the ghoulified version of Eddie Winter to avenge the murder of the real Nick Valentine's fiancée, Jennifer Lands. Nick then shows us the location where Eddie murdered Jennifer, which leaves Nick contemplating who he actually is and what his current purpose in life is now that Eddie's been killed. If we choose to further travel with Nick, we'll eventually find ourselves in the Far Harbor DLC. And while on the island, the player will discover Dima again, which Nick, as we know, is not going to recognize him. Nick is very reluctant to accept Dima as a brother, and with some convincing, eventually Nick can finally accept Dima as his brother. And something that's interesting is while we're playing through the game, or while you're playing through the game, because I haven't got there yet in our playthrough, I'm working towards that, but occasionally whenever they pass each other going through Acadia, which is what Dima is now in charge of, they'll greet each other and have conversation with each other and get along. So that's just a cool little fun fact that once you complete that quest line, it kind of ties up those ends and the two of them can kind of have that brother, connection again.
Look, there's a place in Good Neighbor called the Memory Den. Relive the past moment.
I think it's important to know who the original Nick Valentine is, or at least have an idea. We know he was a police detective from Chicago that was brought into Boston to lead Operation Winter's End. And this was an operation to bring down a mob boss known as Eddie Winter. During this investigation, Eddie, or one of his associates, learned of Nick and his fiancée, and her name was Jennifer Lands. And Jennifer, unfortunately, was killed by either Eddie or one of the associates due to Nick's involvement in the operation. The Bureau of Alcohol, Drugs, Tobacco, Firearms, and Lasers, also known as BADTFL, because that's so much easier to say, received intelligence that would indicate Winter and associates knew Jennifer's whereabouts. But unfortunately, the senior officers decided against placing either Jennifer or Nick into witness protection to avoid compromising the investigation. This clearly was a huge mistake on the department's end, which I guess sadly was likely viewed as a small price to pay to get the bad guy in the eyes of the department. Nick, however, later learned that Eddie Winter worked closely with the district attorney and made a deal with the BADTFL, or the Bureau of Alcohol, Drugs, Tobacco, Firearms, and Lasers, to incriminate his associates in exchange for his immunity. The weeks prior to the bombs dropping, the department closed the operation and ordered Nick to seek treatment for PTSD at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, or simply put, the Institute, where his brain would be scanned for research as part of the treatment. This is how we know The Institute specifically were the ones to obtain Nick's pre-war memories and eventually implant them into a synthetic body for experiments at a future date.
More research. I'll be at the public if you need me.
I think that Nick Valentine is a perfect example of a character of tragedy, in several ways, in fact. The original Nick Valentine, while we don't have a lot of information on him, we do know, though, that he was used. He was manipulated and taken advantage of. He did his job effectively as a detective and even caught the bad guy in the end. But at what cost? Although we don't know much more about the real Nick Valentine, I do think it's safe to assume that he was a law-abiding citizen. He was clearly committed to his career. He had a life, a lover, a future, and it was all snatched away in just an instant and was left alone to pick up the pieces. And then we have the Fallout 4 current day synth version of Nick Valentine. He was an individual that doesn't fully understand where he belongs, as he's physically a synth, but with the mind of a pre-war man. One that is lost and must endure an existence of proving he is more than a synth, but not quite. Human. Which raises the question, are synths human? Or because his mind was artificially implanted, does that make his thoughts, his feelings, his reasons for existing not even his own? I think that's where the player decides based on their own morals and values while they're playing through Fallout 4. I'm personally slightly uncertain on where I stand on this matter because I believe his feelings and thoughts are very real, as they did come from a real person. So maybe the ideas, the thoughts, and feelings are human, but obviously the physical synth form of Nick is not human, but the mind is in fact human. What do you guys think? Let me know down below in the comment section, and thanks for tuning in to this deep dive episode on Nick Valentine.